The Alaskan wilderness doesn't welcome visitors. It only allows them for a while. Mark, an experienced camper, thought he knew what isolation felt like. But nothing had prepared him for the deep forest north of Fairbanks. The trees were dense, the ground frozen solid, and the wind carried a silence so thick it felt almost alive. He set up his tent near a small clearing, the last light of day slipping behind the mountains. Every sound, branches snapping, distant howls, made him pause. Even the air seemed heavier here, like it was watching him. As night fell, the only thing louder than the cold was the quiet. Too quiet, and for the first time, Mark felt that creeping unease that something was waiting. Night had fallen completely. The last streaks of orange light were gone, swallowed by the endless darkness of the Alaskan forest. Mark huddled inside his tent, the cold gnawing at his bones, trying to convince himself he was safe. The small zipper flap rattled as the wind blew, or so he thought. And then he heard it. At first, it was almost imperceptible, a soft, rhythmic sound that didn't belong to the wind or the trees. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, measured. It came from outside the tent. Mark froze. He told himself it was an animal, a fox, maybe a wandering moose. But the sound, it was too deliberate, too human. The breathing moved. Around him. 1 second near the tent's opening, the next brushing the far side. Each exhale brushed against the thin fabric, vibrating against his skin like icy fingers. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. He gripped his flashlight, shining it blindly into the black void beyond the tent. Nothing. And then it stopped. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Mark exhaled shakily, forcing himself to breathe normally. Just the wind, he whispered. But that rational thought died the moment he heard it again. Closer now, louder, each breath echoing as though it had a life of its own. The canvas tent trembled with every inhalation. Panic clawed at him. Mark unzipped the flap slowly, the light slicing into the darkness. Still nothing. The forest was black. No eyes reflecting in the beam, no movement, only the frozen trees staring back like statues. And yet, the breathing continued. Step by step, it circled the tent. The sound came from every direction. Mark spun in place, his flashlight beam darting left and right, cutting through the shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if the night itself was leaning closer. He called out, his voice trembling, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. Only the breathing. Louder now. Faster. Closer. And something else joined it. The snapping of tiny branches, barely audible but perfectly timed with the rhythm of the breaths. It moved in a pattern, deliberate, as if it was toying with him. Mark's mind screamed at him to leave, but his body froze. The fear wasn't just of whatever was out there. It was of being seen, acknowledged, targeted. Then the air changed. The cold deepened. The forest seemed to constrict, pressing in through the tent walls. The breathing was now directly beside his head. Mark could feel the vibration, the almost imperceptible weight of it pressing against the thin fabric. He threw himself backward, hitting the floor of the tent. The breathing stopped. Silence again. But not peaceful, something lingered. Mark's flashlight flickered. He blinked, and for the briefest moment he saw a shadow move outside the tent. Not an animal. Not human. Something wrong. Something impossibly still and impossibly alive. And then it vanished. Mark didn't sleep that night. He stayed upright, trembling, listening to every sound, the wind, the ice, the trees. But he couldn't shake it. The breathing had left its mark. He knew, in the pit of his stomach, that whatever was out there hadn't gone anywhere. It had only waited, and it was patient. The first night had left Mark shaken, barely sleeping, each creak of the tent a new warning. By the second night, he tried to convince himself he had imagined it. The breathing, the shadows, the pressure outside. But tonight it was different. He wasn't alone this time. 2 friends had joined him, thinking the wilderness would be fun, a story to tell. But by dusk, their laughter had faded into quiet tension. Something about this forest wasn't natural. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, like the night itself had teeth. They lit a fire at the edge of their clearing, hoping the glow would keep fear at bay. But the darkness didn't retreat. It danced just beyond the firelight, moving with a patience that made their skin crawl. And then came the sound, footsteps. Not just near the tent, around it. Soft, deliberate, pacing. One foot in front of the other. Step, pause, each aligned perfectly with the natural rhythm of the camper's own movements. Every time they moved closer to investigate, the steps would retreat just out of sight. It wasn't chasing them, it wasn't playing, it was learning, watching, calculating. It's just an animal, one friend whispered, voice trembling, clutching a flashlight. But Mark could feel it. Something wrong, something intelligent, something patient. The fire flickered, shadows stretching long and twisting into shapes that didn't belong. Or just imagination. It didn't matter, their instinct screamed danger. Then the voice came. Almost indistinguishable from the wind at first. A whisper. Their heads snapped toward the sound. Nothing. Absolute black. And then another whisper, this time a friend's name. The tone was familiar, comforting even, but wrong. Hollow. Mocking. Panic surged. They grabbed their flashlights and shone them into the trees. Branches snapped as if something was stepping carefully, avoiding light, but following them. Shadows moved against the firelight, too large, too fluid, too deliberate. Every movement they made was mirrored by something unseen. And then came the cold. Not the normal cold of Alaska, but a bone-deep, unnatural chill, freezing their fingers, crawling under clothing, tightening around their chest. The breathing from the previous night returned, slow at first, now louder, more confident, circling them like a predator assessing prey. The pattern was terrifyingly deliberate, synchronizing with their attempts to flee. One friend, shaking violently, tried to call out, but the whisper returned first. Don't move. The tone was sharp now, commanding. The forest responded. Branches cracked close enough to hear twigs snap beneath invisible feet. Every shadow now felt alive, every rustle a threat. They huddled near the fire, hoping light would protect them. But the shadows stretched unnaturally, moving faster than the eye could follow, twisting in ways the human mind wasn't meant to process. Something was circling, always at the edge of perception, testing boundaries. Mark could feel it pressing in, not physically, but psychologically, invading the mind, implanting panic, feeding off their terror. Time became meaningless. Minutes felt like hours. Every exhale, every step, every flicker of the fire made them certain they were being watched, studied, hunted. Sleep was impossible. The forest around them was no longer a place of nature. It was alive, predatory, and patient. By the end of the night, all three campers sat frozen in silence, listening to the slow, deliberate breathing that moved around them. They dared not speak, dared not move, for fear it would notice. And deep in the shadows, beyond the firelight, something was learning, plotting, waiting for the night to end, but not for them to survive it. By the fourth night, the forest no longer felt like nature. It had claimed the clearing, the fire, even the cold air itself. Mark and his friends were exhausted, sleep-deprived, their nerves shredded by the previous nights. They thought they knew fear, but fear had a new name now, something alive, intelligent, and hungry. The rules they had tried to follow, stay silent, don't respond, don't move carelessly, had failed. Every small sound, every mistake, had been noticed. The forest had been watching, learning, waiting for them to slip. And tonight, the waiting ended. It began with a scream. One of the friends, trying to check the perimeter, tripped over frozen roots. That single sound, a human error, triggered everything. The darkness around the fire seemed to shimmer, twist, and condense. Shadows moved unnaturally, faster than the eye could follow, converging on them. The breathing returned, but now it was not just outside the tent. It was inside the perimeter of their very minds, echoing their fear. Step after step, closer, deliberate, synchronized with their panicked heartbeats. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, every gust of wind was now amplified, monstrous. Mark shouted, grabbing a flashlight, swinging it wildly. Something moved in the trees, but not like an animal. It glided, almost silent, always at the edge of the beam. Its presence was oppressive, a weight that pressed on their chests, stealing breath and clarity. One friend's voice trembled. It's following us. But the words were swallowed by the forest. And then a whisper, not their names this time, not a call, a command, stop moving or it will take you. Their fire flickered violently. Shadows danced across the clearing. One tent flap lifted briefly, no wind, and a cold, unseen force swept through the campsite, rattling their gear, knocking the small supplies over. Panic consumed them. They ran in all directions, stumbling through the snow and ice, calling out for each other. But the forest had them. It was everywhere. Footsteps now moved against the terrain, breaking the natural laws of sound. Breathing was inside the tents, under the snow, above them, impossible yet undeniable. The air vibrated with the entity's presence. Mark froze in the center of the clearing, trying to make sense of the chaos. And then he saw it, just for a heartbeat, a shadowy figure, taller than any human, its limbs bending wrong, its face hidden but somehow knowing. It moved impossibly fast, circled them, vanished before the eye could process. One friend screamed and was gone. Not dragged, not attacked. Simply disappeared. The remaining two couldn't even cry out. Terror had robbed them of sound, of rational thought. They ran blindly, the forest shifting around them as if alive, corralling them back toward the clearing. Finally, Mark and the last friend stumbled back into the firelight. Everything was still. The missing friend's tent was empty, gear untouched. Footprints led nowhere. And then, the final whisper, "You were warned." Silence. Absolute, oppressive, suffocating silence. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't move. They could only feel it, the forest breathing around them, patient, waiting, ensuring they understood. By sunrise, they were still alive, but something had been claimed. And deep down, Mark knew it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The first light of dawn struggled through the dense Alaskan forest, pale and cold. Mark and his remaining friend sat motionless in the clearing, eyes wide, ears straining for any sound. The world felt smaller, twisted, wrong. The night's terror wasn't gone, it had left its mark. Their missing friend's tent remained empty, untouched. Footprints led nowhere. No sign of a struggle, no clue of what had taken him. Just an emptiness that pressed on their minds, like a memory of something too vast to name. They spoke little, whispering only to coordinate packing their gear, their voices hushed as if speaking louder might draw attention. Every shadow, every flicker of wind through the trees made them jump. Every crunch of frost beneath their feet was amplified, terrifyingly precise. Mark kept looking over his shoulder, sensing movement that shouldn't exist. The air was still, yet heavy, like the forest itself was breathing around them. Something was there. Watching. Waiting. Not hungry, not aggressive now, patient, calculating. They had survived, but it wasn't done. The forest seemed to stretch unnaturally, trees bending slightly toward them as they walked, shadows lengthening beyond reason. A faint, rhythmic breathing echoed in the distance, far enough to seem unreal, close enough to be terrifying. It was almost playful, knowing that the campers had nowhere to hide, that they were exposed, that they understood the rules too late. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning. Every moment brought an acute awareness. The terror was no longer external. It had burrowed inside them. Their minds were stretched thin, nerves raw. Every glance into the darkness revealed nothing. Yet the presence was undeniable. When they finally reached the edge of the clearing, and the first real rays of sunlight pierced the forest, they stumbled out, trembling. Their eyes darted over every tree, every shadow. Mark could feel it even then. A weight in the air, an echo of what had followed them, an unseen gaze that lingered long after their bodies left. They never spoke of the details, not the whispers, not the breathing, not the shadowy figure that had circled them. But Mark knew, and he felt it every time he closed his eyes. The forest had claimed something of them. A piece of their peace, a shard of their sanity. They didn't look back. Not until decades later, When Mark recounted the story to someone who would listen, did he whisper the final, lingering truth? The waits, boys. Not just for you, but for anyone who thinks the forest is empty, anyone who thinks the night is safe. And sometimes it remembers the ones it let go. The second night in the Alaskan wilderness began with a false sense of security. Mark thought he had survived the first night by sheer luck, and tonight, he wasn't alone. 2 friends had joined him, bringing a small campfire to the clearing and a brief sense of warmth against the endless cold. They laughed nervously, joking about last night's imagined terror, the way humans do when fear clings just below the surface. The trees loomed tall and silent around them, branches clawing at the sky, snow glinting faintly in the pale moonlight. The wind whispered through the forest, and though they laughed, they all felt it. The shadows seemed thicker here, darker, almost conscious. They poked at the fire, tossing small sticks in and watching sparks vanish into the night. Every sound felt amplified, the distant crack of a branch, the subtle shift of snow under unseen weight, the quiet sigh of the wind. It was alive and breathing. And somewhere just beyond the firelight, something moved. At first, it was subtle. A shadow flickered between 2 trees. Something not quite aligned with the natural patterns of the forest, too deliberate, too silent. Mark noticed it first, squinting, focusing, trying to convince himself it was just the moon reflecting on the branches. But it wasn't the moon. It wasn't anything he recognized. A snapping twig somewhere behind them made all 3 jump. Their laughter died in their throats. One friend said, "Probably a fox or something." But their tone betrayed them, even they didn't believe it. Every crack of the forest seemed measured, synchronized with the rhythm of their own hearts, as if the forest was testing them, studying them, waiting for a single mistake. The air grew colder. Not the normal bite of Alaskan night, but sharp, penetrating, like invisible fingers wrapping around their bones. Their breaths fogged in front of their faces, and the warmth of the fire seemed insufficient, weak against the creeping presence. Every shadow stretched farther than it should, warped unnaturally in the moonlight, and movement flickered just beyond the corner of their vision. Mark tried to speak, trying to break the tension, but the words felt hollow. A faint rustle came from the treeline. Not a breeze, not a falling branch, something deliberate, careful, observing. Their eyes darted around, catching glimpses of shapes that weren't quite trees, not quite shadows, disappearing the instant they looked directly. They told themselves to stay calm. "It's the forest. Nothing more," one whispered, but the whisper itself seemed swallowed by the night, vanishing into the cold. There was no comfort here. The firelight did not penetrate far enough. And the farther they looked, the deeper the blackness became, as though the darkness itself was alive, hiding, waiting. And in that false security, that fragile bubble of warmth and light, the first real terror began to creep in, subtle, insidious, and unavoidable. Something was out there, stalking them, patient and silent, watching every movement. And though they didn't yet know it, the night had already decided who would feel its full wrath and who might survive. Night deepened, and the fire's light barely cut through the dense black of the Alaskan forest. Mark and his friends tried to shake off the unease, telling themselves the forest was alive but not malicious. But the moment they convinced themselves of safety, it started. A sound, almost imperceptible. A soft, careful footstep in the snow just beyond the circle of firelight. Then another, and another. Not random, not chaotic, deliberate. Someone or something was moving around them, studying them, pacing, always just at the edge of vision. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. Mark pointed into the darkness. "Do you see that?" Nothing. Only trees, only shadows, only snow reflecting the weak firelight. Yet the feeling was undeniable. They were being watched. Then the rustling came. Not the wind. Not falling branches. Something purposeful. The trees seemed to bend slightly, shadows stretching toward them unnaturally. Mark's flashlight trembled in his hand as he swung it toward the noise. Nothing visible, only darkness moving like liquid. And then came the whisper. Soft at first, like the wind brushing through the trees. "Mark?" His blood ran cold. He froze. The voice was familiar, intimate, impossibly close, but not human. A friend's name followed, whispered with a hollow, mocking tone. They tried to speak, but their own voices died in their throats. The footsteps accelerated, circling closer. Sparks from the fire flickered, casting shadows that twisted into shapes that shouldn't exist. Every instinct screamed to run, yet every step forward seemed mirrored by the entity. It was learning, adjusting, waiting. One of the friends grabbed a stick, throwing it toward the darkness. The sound of it landing barely registered. The rustling didn't pause, didn't react. The entity wasn't hunting yet, not fully. It was studying, mocking, playing, and it was winning. The cold deepened unnaturally. Frost formed on their gear, snow hardened beneath their boots. Their breaths hung in the air, visible, quivering with fear. Every flicker of the fire seemed to pull the darkness closer, stretching it, warping the forest itself. A branch snapped directly behind Mark. He whirled, nothing. But the air shifted, heavier now, almost pushing against his chest. He could feel it, a presence close enough to touch, cold, malignant, patient. And then, just beyond the firelight, he saw it. A shadowy shape, humanoid but wrong. Limbs bending in impossible ways, a black void where a face should be. And it moved, gliding, circling, always staying just out of reach. His friends screamed, shouting his name, and the entity answered, not with words, but with a whispering wind that repeated their voices, warped and hollow. Every attempt to flee brought them back closer to the fire, closer to the darkness, as if the forest itself had become alive, an extension of the predator. And then silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Not peace, an ominous pause. The shadow had retreated, for now. But Mark and his friends could feel it in their bones. It was still there, watching, waiting, calculating. Night had only just begun, and the stalking had only started. By the time they huddled around the fire, hearts hammering, breaths short, the realization hit them. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a predator, and tonight it had learned how to stalk them. The forest had learned them. Every habit, every glance, every tiny movement around the fire had been noted. By the time the third hour of night rolled in, the stalking presence grew bolder, more confident. Shadows no longer lingered at the edge of the clearing. They moved. Slowly, deliberately, circling, always just beyond the firelight, always just out of reach. Mark's heart pounded as the first whispers returned. Not random words, names. Names of his friends, his own, called softly but unmistakably, each syllable stretched, hollow, taunting. The voices were close enough to feel, yet impossible to locate. Every time he turned, nothing. Nothing but the warped shapes of trees, and darkness that seemed almost liquid. One friend whispered, trembling, "It's following us." And it was. Each step they tried to take away from the fire seemed mirrored. Footsteps in the snow, perfectly aligned with theirs, snapped on broken twigs, circling, always observing. The shadows leaned in with impossible angles, stretching as if the night itself was bending toward them. The fire flickered violently. Sparks leapt, carried by gusts that had no origin, and the wind shifted unnaturally, brushing icy fingers across their necks. They clutched their jackets, arms wrapped tight, but the cold was different now, not natural, not from the air. It pressed against them, burrowing under clothes, freezing skin, tightening lungs. Then came movement beyond the firelight, something gliding from tree to tree, limbs too long, too thin, bending wrong. It paused just long enough for Mark to catch a glimpse, eyes, or perhaps holes, dark and endless, staring directly at them. The entity was no longer content to hide. It was toying with them. Panic set in. One friend ran a few steps into the darkness, screaming, only for the steps to echo wrong, mirrored, returning to them, as if the forest had folded over itself. Mark tried to grab them, but the space felt warped, unfamiliar, disorienting. A branch snapped violently above them. They froze. Then the whispers returned. Not gentle this time, but harsh. "You cannot hide. You cannot escape. We know." The campers huddled together, backs to the fire. Every flicker of shadow seemed like a threat. Every sound, footsteps, branches, snow crunching, made their hearts leap. Their breaths formed clouds in the freezing air, shallow and rapid, trembling with fear. And every time they looked up, the shapes moved closer, just a little, testing boundaries, learning. Time lost all meaning. Minutes became hours. The fire's glow did not reach far enough to offer comfort. They were trapped in a ring of darkness, stalked, hunted, observed by something that seemed to know them intimately, as if it had studied their minds as well as their bodies. And then the first touch. Not physical, not seen, but a pressure, a weight that pressed on Mark's shoulder, icy, cold, invasive. His friends shrieked, but the sound seemed absorbed by the night. The entity was no longer merely stalking, they had been marked. By the end of the night, the campers sat trembling, frozen, barely breathing, hearts hammering. They dared not speak. They dared not move. Every instinct screamed at them that leaving the firelight would bring immediate doom. The forest, alive, patient, hungry, had claimed them in fear. And in the shadows beyond, a shape glided silently, watching, circling, waiting for the next slip, the next mistake, the next panic to devour. By the fourth hour, the forest was no longer just a backdrop. It had become an extension of the predators stalking them. Shadows moved independently of the firelight, stretching and twisting into forms that should not exist. The air was thick with a suffocating cold, the kind that burrowed into their bones and froze their blood. Mark's heart hammered as he realized the stalking was no longer subtle. The entity was closing in. Every flicker of firelight revealed glimpses of limbs bending in impossible directions, dark voids where a face should be, eyes that glowed faintly with intelligence and malice. The shadows were alive, circling them, twisting reality around their small clearing. "We have to leave," one friend whispered, voice trembling. But escape had become impossible. Every step away from the fire brought them back toward the center of the clearing, as if the forest itself were corralling them. Panic clawed at their minds. The entity was no longer patient. It wanted a reaction, a scream, a terror it could feed on. A snapping branch behind Mark made him whirl. Something moved fast, impossibly fast, gliding across the snow, circling, stalking. A faint whisper, cruel and deliberate, "Stop. Or stay." One friend ran. Only a few steps. Then nothing. No scream. No struggle. Just silence. And a shadow where they had stood, darker than the rest, shifting unnaturally in the weak firelight. Mark tried to call their name. His voice caught in his throat, swallowed by the forest. The entity made its presence undeniable. Something brushed past Mark, cold, heavy, invasive, like a hand made of ice and shadow. His mind screamed to flee, but the forest disoriented him, paths folding back impossibly, twisting him toward the clearing again. His friends' terrified cries echoed in his ears, distorted, warped, like the forest itself was mocking them. The fire sputtered and nearly died, plunging the clearing into darkness, but for a brief heartbeat, the entity revealed itself fully. A humanoid figure, taller than any human, limbs bending at impossible angles, black void where a face should be, eyes glowing faintly with intelligence. It didn't move like a normal creature. It floated, glided, stretched reality around it. Mark and the last friend huddled together, frozen, unable to move or breathe properly. Every instinct screamed terror, every nerve ending screaming that survival depended on stillness. But still, the entity pressed, circling closer, whispering names, echoing panic. The forest itself responded to its presence, branches snapping, snow crunching, shadows deepening, as if the world itself had become part of the hunt. Then, the final moment. The entity paused just at the edge of the firelight. No movement, only presence. Mark could feel its awareness in every nerve, every heartbeat, every shallow breath. And then it withdrew slightly, fading into the shadows, leaving them trembling, broken, terrified. But they understood the truth. They had survived, yes, but barely. The forest had claimed their fear, their sanity, their very awareness. And as they huddled silently, shivering, they could feel it waiting, patient, intelligent, unstoppable. The stalking had escalated. The hunt was far from over, and the entity knew exactly where they would go next, and when the next slip would cost them everything. Dawn broke over the Alaskan forest, but the light did little to comfort them. Mark and his remaining friend emerged from the clearing, frozen, trembling, and silent. The snow around the firelight was disturbed, prints leading in impossible directions, twisted impressions that made no sense. The forest seemed alive, still watching, still judging. Their missing friend was gone. No trace, no struggle, no explanation. Just absence. And yet, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, like the forest had swallowed something essential from them. Every crunch of snow beneath their feet echoed unnaturally. Every gust of wind whispered hints of the stalking presence. They walked side by side, afraid to look behind, but every shadow along the path seemed to shift, stretch, and reach just enough to remind them it had not left. The forest itself seemed complicit, every tree bending slightly, every branch twisting, casting shadows that moved when they didn't. Mark's mind raced. Names whispered in the night still echoed, distorted, taunting. Every breath felt cold, unnatural, invasive. They had survived, yes, but survival felt hollow. Something intangible had been taken: peace, innocence, safety. And worse, they knew it had been watching, learning, waiting for another night. The forest held its secrets close. The entity had vanished for now, but Mark could feel it: patient, intelligent, unstoppable. The stalker had claimed part of their sanity, embedding fear that would not fade. Even in daylight, even as the sun crept higher, the shadows seemed to linger just beyond the treeline, shifting when they dared not look. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Words had no power here. Only the heavy knowledge that the forest was alive in ways they could not comprehend, and that the entity had not just observed them, it had marked them. And as they finally reached the edge of the clearing, leaving the firelight behind, Mark whispered, almost to himself, "The waits, boys. Watching. Patient. Knowing. And next time, it will not be patient." The forest swallowed their words, the shadows swallowed their steps, and the stalking presence remained, a silent predator in the endless night. The terror was unresolved, the hunt ongoing, and the memory of the darkness would never leave them. Night 3 in the Alaskan wilderness began under a cold, indifferent sky. Mark and the remaining campers returned to the clearing, weary from 2 nights of terror but clinging to a fragile sense of control. The snow glimmered faintly under the moon, and the trees loomed tall and silent, their twisted branches like bony fingers reaching down to the frozen ground. They built the fire quickly, throwing sticks and logs onto the flames, desperate for warmth and comfort. Laughter broke out briefly, hollow, nervous, but it faded almost instantly. There was a heaviness in the air, oppressive, as if the forest remembered them and their past mistakes. Something ancient lingered here, something that had rules they had never been told. Mark noticed faint markings on the trees, symbols scratched deeply into bark, jagged lines and loops that pulsed faintly in the dim firelight. He brushed it off as the work of previous campers, until he realized the markings seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The snow around the clearing bore unnatural patterns, footprints that looped in impossible ways, marks that suggested something had been pacing, watching. Probably just animals, one friend whispered, trying to convince themselves, but the tone carried no conviction. The wind carried faint whispers, not entirely words, just murmurs that grazed the edges of hearing, a warning that none of them heeded. And when Mark stepped on a small, unmarked patch of snow near a tree, a sudden shiver ran down his spine, deep and cold, as if unseen eyes had pierced him. Ignorance had always been their armor. But here, in the forest's heart, ignorance was a blade pointed directly at them. They joked about rules, silly things one should or shouldn't do, but the forest did not tolerate jokes. It watched, it remembered, it punished. And as the fire crackled, the shadows stretched unnaturally, bending toward them. One branch scraped across a symbol on a tree, and it almost seemed to pulse, alive with silent judgment. Mark's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed, "Do not disturb. Do not speak." "Do not move beyond what is allowed." But the campers were already too curious. They did not yet understand the forest's rules, and by night's deepening, their ignorance would cost them dearly. In the distance, faint eyes glowed from the darkness, unblinking and patient. A presence stirred, coiling through the trees, moving through the snow, intelligent and deliberate. And though nothing had touched them yet, the forest's warning was clear. The rules were absolute, invisible, unforgiving, and they had already begun to break them. The night deepened, and the false sense of safety dissolved like frost in sunlight. Mark and his friends, still unaware of the forest's invisible laws, wandered a few steps beyond the firelight, their curiosity outweighing their fear. The air grew colder with every step, heavier, pressing against their lungs, as though the forest itself exhaled its displeasure. One camper, drawn to a strange symbol carved into a twisted tree, reached out to touch it. The instant their fingers grazed the bark, the world shifted. The shadows bent sharply, stretching unnaturally, and the wind erupted with shrill, whispered voices that echoed inside their skulls. "You do not belong. You do not belong." Panic set in, but instinct screamed to flee. Every path they tried to take led them back to the clearing, twisted and looping unnaturally. Snow underfoot was disturbed in impossible patterns. Footprints that led nowhere, circling endlessly, as if the forest itself was mocking them. Then came the first tangible terror. Shadows condensed into forms, humanoid but impossible, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, eyes glowing faintly, void-like, intelligent. One glided silently through the snow, moving closer, testing, observing. It did not chase. It punished. Every movement, every step beyond the unspoken rules brought consequences. The fire sputtered, flickered, then roared violently as if responding to their transgressions. Branches cracked overhead, falling almost deliberately, narrowly missing them. The air was thick with a suffocating cold, clawing at skin and lungs, pressing deeper into bones. Each breath was a struggle. One friend spoke, trying to apologize aloud to the forest, to whatever watched them, but the words returned distorted, warped, as if spat back by the trees themselves. "You ignored the rules. You ignored the rules." Every symbol they had ignored earlier now seemed alive. The carved patterns glowed faintly, pulsing, almost breathing. The wind carried the whispers of previous victims, fragmented names, half-words, screams swallowed into the night. The forest was teaching them lessons the only way it knew, with pain, fear, and terror. Something brushed past Mark's leg, cold, sharp, invasive. He stumbled, almost falling into the snow. The shadow loomed closer, gliding silently, and for a brief moment, the form coalesced fully, taller than any human, limbs bending impossibly, void-like face fixed upon him. It radiated punishment, judgment, inevitability. The campers realized, too late, that ignorance had been their shield, and curiosity had shattered it. The forest, the entity, and the rules were one, absolute, unforgiving, omnipresent. Every sound, every movement, every flicker of shadow reinforced the truth. Breaking the rules would cost them dearly. They retreated, panicked, into the clearing, but even there, the forest pressed, circling, whispering. The entity did not vanish. It lingered, patient, watching, ensuring that the lesson had been received. The forest's rules were not suggestions, and trespassers would pay. The forest did not forgive. It did not forget. By the time Mark and his remaining friends realized the consequences of their actions, it was already too late. Paths that had seemed familiar twisted unnaturally beneath their feet. Snow-covered trails looped endlessly, turning them back toward the clearing no matter which way they ran. The forest was alive, and it had claimed them as trespassers. The first consequence came quietly, yet with absolute inevitability. One friend stumbled over a jagged root, calling out for help. But the voice was swallowed by the trees, distorted and warped, returned to them as something unrecognizable, a mockery of their panic. When Mark turned, the friend was gone, vanished as if swallowed by the darkness itself. No footprints led away, no sound betrayed a struggle. Only silence, and a faint pulse of glowing symbols on the nearby trees. Panic erupted, raw and uncontained. They tried to flee, but the forest responded, bending the world around them. Trees shifted imperceptibly, shadows stretched and coiled like living snakes, and every instinctive path led them back to the center of the clearing. The whispers returned, sharp, deliberate, accusing. You broke the rules. You disobeyed. You belong to us now. Mark's heart pounded as he realized the rules were not suggestions. They were laws, enforced with precision and cruelty. The forest itself seemed to punish, branches snapping with exacting intent, snow erupting around them with every misstep. Shadows swirled violently, condensing into impossible forms. Humanoid figures with elongated limbs, void-like faces, eyes glowing faintly with intelligence and malice. They circled the campers, closer, faster, measuring fear like a predator sizing up prey. Each breath became a labor. The cold was unnatural, gnawing at flesh, seeping into lungs, stiffening muscles. Every sound, a twig cracking, a whisper, the crunch of snow, set their nerves on fire. The entity emerged fully from the darkness, towering and impossible, gliding silently, limbs bending at angles no human body should tolerate. It moved deliberately, its every motion a lesson in punishment. Mark screamed, a sound swallowed immediately by the oppressive forest. Shadows danced across the trees, forming symbols that pulsed with malevolent energy. The air vibrated with the murmurs of those who had come before, half-whispered names, muffled cries, warnings. They were all victims, all consumed by the forest for ignoring its laws. And now, the campers understood, survival was no longer about escape. It was about obedience, submission, and terror. They tried to speak, to apologize, but words were useless. The forest heard thought, intention, hesitation. Every glance beyond the firelight was met with malevolent intelligence, eyes glowing faintly, reflecting memory and judgment. The entity was patient. It did not strike blindly. It waited for mistakes, feeding on fear, thriving on the knowledge of their guilt. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. When dawn finally began to bleed weak light through the dense canopy, the forest relented only partially. One friend was gone, vanished into shadow and snow. The remaining campers staggered to the edge of the clearing, hollow-eyed, shivering, haunted by what they had seen, touched, and survived. Symbols carved into trees seemed to pulse faintly even in daylight. Whispers carried faintly on the wind. Mark realized they had learned something no human should, that the forest had rules, that those rules were absolute, and that ignorance or defiance came at a terrible price. The entity, patient and eternal, watched from the darkness, marking the survivors, waiting, knowing that curiosity and fear would draw them back one day. The lingering curse remained. They carried it in their bones, their minds, their souls. The forest had taught them, through terror and loss, the weight of disobedience. And though they left the clearing, stepping into daylight, they could feel it watching. Silent, patient, unforgiving. Mark whispered to himself, trembling, voice barely audible over the rustle of branches. The rules are eternal. They wait. And if we ever return, the forest will not forgive. The shadows did not fade. They never do. And the forest, alive with judgment, waited patiently for the next trespassers, hungry for fear, for ignorance, for defiance. Night 4 in the Alaskan wilderness began with a silence that was heavier than any sound. Mark and his remaining friends returned to the clearing, each step dragging their minds further into exhaustion and fear. The snow glimmered under the weak moonlight, but it offered no comfort. Every shadow seemed thicker, darker, more alive than before. The forest had learned them. It remembered every scream, every misstep, every violation of its rules. The fire they lit seemed fragile, almost unwilling to burn. Sparks leapt weakly, only to vanish into the oppressive darkness, as if swallowed by the forest itself. Branches twisted at impossible angles, scraping together with unnatural precision, forming shapes that were not quite trees, not quite limbs, but something in between. The wind shifted violently, carrying whispers not just of their names, but of their fears, memories, and failures. You cannot escape. You cannot survive. Early on, the forest began to assert itself physically. Snow underfoot shifted in impossible ways, forming paths that looped and twisted, doubling back, erasing any sense of direction. Trees bent subtly to block potential exits, their trunks elongating unnaturally, casting monstrous shadows across the campers. Every instinct screamed that the forest was alive, and it had decided to play with them like trapped prey. Mark's mind began to fracture under the assault. The whispers grew louder, now echoing past conversations, mocking laughter, distorted cries of those who had vanished before. The forest seemed to pull memories from their minds, twisting them into hallucinations. Faces that weren't there, figures just beyond the firelight, eyes staring from places impossible to exist. One friend saw a fallen comrade walking silently through the snow, only to vanish when touched, leaving a scream frozen in his throat. Panic overtook reason. The forest's assault became more aggressive. Branches whipped across their faces as if alive, knocking sticks from their hands, disorienting them further. Snow hardened underfoot, then suddenly gave way, making them stumble into areas that seemed darker, colder, more hostile. The entity, patient for so long, glided from shadow to shadow. Humanoid but impossible, limbs bending at unnatural angles, void-like face watching every movement, feeding on fear. The campers tried to flee, but the forest had erased the concept of distance. Each step forward led them back to the same clearing, the same flickering fire, the same oppressive shadows. Time itself seemed to stretch, compress, and twist. Minutes felt like hours, hours like seconds, and still the forest whispered, warned, and judged. One friend, driven to desperation, screamed a name, a plea, begging for the entity to leave them alone. But the forest responded not with silence, but with presence. Shadows multiplied, stretching toward them, and the air thickened into icy pressure, pressing into lungs, bones, and minds alike. Every heartbeat was mirrored by an unseen watcher, every breath noted, every flicker of panic amplified. By the time the night had deepened, the campers realized the truth. The forest was no longer a place. It was a sentient predator, a living nightmare. They were not intruders, they were its playthings. Every rule broken, every step taken beyond what was permitted, had brought them closer to total collapse. Mark's hands shook as he tried to gather the group. The shadows shifted violently, branches snapped like whips, snow erupted around them in unnatural bursts. The entity hovered just beyond the firelight, taller than any human, movements fluid, impossible, intelligent, waiting for panic to peak. And as the night pressed on, they understood with absolute clarity, control was gone. Sanity was fragile, and the forest would not relent. The descent had begun. Chaos had arrived, and Nightfall had only just started. The forest had abandoned all pretense of stillness. Darkness pressed in from every side, thick, palpable, as if it had substance, and every shadow had a will of its own. Mark and the remaining campers were no longer mere intruders. They were prey in a realm where laws of reality bent and broke under the entity's will. The first attack came subtly. A branch snapped directly above Mark's head, but the sound didn't come from the branch. It came from inside his skull. His ears rang with distorted whispers. "You cannot escape. You do not belong. You are ours." He spun, eyes wide, only to see the snow around him ripple unnaturally, footprints forming, erasing, forming again, mocking every step. Then the entity appeared. Not in flashes, not glimpsed, fully. Taller than any human, limbs bending at impossible angles, its void-like face fixed on them, glowing eyes intelligent and cruel. It didn't move like a predator. It glided, unbound by gravity or reason, coiling around the campers, anticipating panic before it even rose. Every movement of theirs was mirrored, amplified, twisted. One friend screamed, breaking through the taut tension. The shadows responded. Trees bent unnaturally, branches whipping downward like whips, snow exploding from the ground in jagged bursts, forcing them to stagger back into the center of the clearing. The fire sputtered violently, then roared, casting light that revealed the forest had changed. Branches now formed grotesque, humanoid shapes, faces twisted in silent screams, watching, judging. Hallucinations erupted. Mark saw his missing friends from previous nights, walking silently through the snow, their faces twisted, eyes hollow and accusing. Every whisper, every footstep, every faint rustle became a distorted echo of horror. He could not tell real from imagined. Time fractured. Minutes became endless. Seconds collapsed into eternity. The forest itself assaulted them. The snow shifted like living waves, rising and falling, trapping their feet, pushing them toward danger. Hollow gusts of wind cut through the clearing, carrying screams from nowhere, laughter from somewhere else, and whispers and voices that sounded like their own. The entity was everywhere, nowhere, manipulating the very world around them, testing their sanity, tearing their minds apart piece by piece. Mark's friend tried to run toward the treeline, only for the path to fold impossibly, bringing them back to the clearing. Shadows reached out, black tendrils stretching unnaturally from the trees, curling around limbs, brushing against skin with icy pressure that burned. Panic became paralysis. Every heartbeat echoed in their skulls as if amplified by the forest itself. The entity paused briefly, observing, patient, feeding on terror. Its glowing eyes scanned them, intelligent, calculating, waiting for a slip, a cry, a movement that would earn a punishment more severe than the last. Then it struck. Not with claws, not with teeth, but with reality itself. The snow beneath one camper erupted into a wave of jagged ice, toppling them. Another screamed as shadows twisted around their limbs, elongating impossibly, pinning them without contact, bending the forest to torment. The forest became a symphony of madness. Branches cracking, snow exploding, whispers, distorted screams, shadows coiling, fire flickering violently, wind tearing at their clothing, and the entity hovering in the center. Silent, intelligent, perfect. Mark could feel his mind fraying. Reality no longer existed outside fear. Every glance, every sound, every breath was dominated by one truth. They were completely powerless. One by one, the campers began to vanish. Not screams, not struggle, just absence, as if erased by the forest itself. Mark clutched at the last friend, but the snow shifted, shadows twisted, and the entity glided between them effortlessly, eyes boring into his soul, assessing, calculating, punishing. Hours? Or was it moments? Passed. When the forest finally relented slightly, leaving Mark trembling, soaked in fear, hollow-eyed, and gasping for breath, the clearing was littered with impossible footprints, broken branches, and echoes of cries that had never fully existed. The entity had withdrawn, but not disappeared. Its presence lingered like poison in the air, a reminder of the forest's absolute dominance. Mark realized with crushing clarity, Night 4 had stripped everything: control, safety, reason. What remained was total collapse. The forest and its entity had won, and the survivors were marked, shattered, and utterly changed. Madness was not a threat, it was inevitable, and the entity, patient and eternal, would wait for the next moment to continue its hunt. By now, Night 4 had become an unending nightmare. The forest no longer resembled a forest. It was a living entity, bending reality, warping time, and devouring sanity. Snow shifted beneath their feet like liquid, paths twisted endlessly, and shadows merged into colossal, impossible shapes that moved with intent. Mark and the last of his friends were trapped in a world that obeyed no law except the will of the entity. The collapse began subtly at first. The ground heaved beneath them, ice cracking in jagged patterns, forcing them to stumble into deeper darkness. Trees bent unnaturally, stretching their twisted limbs toward the campers like hungry fingers. The whispers grew deafening, voices overlapping, chanting names, fears, failures, and sins, echoing in the very marrow of their bones. You cannot survive. You are ours. You belong to the forest. Then the entity struck fully. It moved with an intelligence that was terrifyingly patient, gliding through the darkness, limbs bending at impossible angles. Its void-like face fixed on Mark as shadows burst from every direction, coiling around the campers with icy pressure, freezing muscles, choking air, warping reality. Trees seemed to fall, yet nothing struck them. Snow erupted like living blades. The wind carried distorted screams that sliced into their minds. One friend screamed, vanishing instantly as shadows swallowed him. Another staggered into the darkness and disappeared without trace. Mark tried to run, but paths folded impossibly, looping back into the heart of the collapsing clearing. Light distorted, fire sputtered and roared with unnatural intensity, revealing the forest's grotesque shapes. Faces carved into bark twisted silently in torment, shadows forming monstrous humanoid silhouettes, and the entity observing, patient, calculating, omnipresent. Time ceased to exist normally. Minutes stretched like hours, seconds collapsed into eternity. Mark could no longer tell what was real or hallucination. Snow underfoot morphed with every step. Branches became reaching limbs, scraping skin, tearing at clothing, moving impossibly fast. Every sound was amplified: the crunch of snow, the snapping of branches, the whispers of previous victims, all merging into a symphony of terror. The forest had won. Control was gone. Sanity fractured. Survival was no longer an option. The entity, patient and eternal, hovered above the chaos, a sentinel of punishment and inevitability. Every heartbeat, every breath, every glance was observed, calculated, and judged. The forest was a predator, reality itself a weapon, and Mark was nothing but prey. By the deepest part of the night, only Mark remained, or perhaps he too had begun to vanish into the nightmare. The clearing was unrecognizable, distorted by the forest's will. Shadows stretched infinitely, symbols carved into trees glowed faintly like breathing eyes, snow shifted and churned with impossible patterns. The entity lingered in every corner, every shadow, every flicker of light, patient, waiting for curiosity, fear, or defiance to draw him fully into its grasp. When dawn eventually bled weakly through the twisted canopy, it did not bring relief. Mark emerged, hollow-eyed, shaking, barely alive, a shell of his former self. The forest had claimed everything else. One glance back revealed nothing tangible, just the faint shimmer of distorted shadows, the pulsing glow of symbols, and the omnipresent feeling of being watched. He understood. The forest was eternal, intelligent, merciless, and victorious. Its rules were absolute. Its entity, patient and unstoppable, would wait, always. Night 4 had not ended. It had only collapsed reality, sanity, and hope entirely. And for Mark and any who dared return, the terror would never truly leave.